Hi, thanks for coming tonight on a rainy night. I'm Gwen Robinson, the president of the FCCT and the editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. And I'm here to introduce and try and help moderate our speaker tonight, Brian Eyler, author of that excellent book you can see on the screen there, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong. Brian is director of the Stimson Centre's Southeast Asia program in Washington, D.C., and he previously directed study abroad centres in Beijing and Kunming, China, for IES Abroad, and has led many study tours throughout the Mekong region and knows both Yunnan and this region extremely well. So Brian's going to give a talk and show us some slides, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then I'll open the floor to questions. So over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Gwen. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here. This is the first opportunity for me to launch the book, or to give a book talk in Southeast Asia. We're not in the Mekong, so I can't say this is the first opportunity that we can do it in the Mekong basin, but it's great to be here at the FCCT and to be among old friends and some new faces. And I thank you for your interest in the Mekong and in this book. This book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, came together over a period of about 4 years, where I was asked to write this book. I was, I guess, selected because of writing that I did previously on China's economic expansion into Southeast Asia on my website, East by Southeast. And the editor, Paul French, you might know him, the writer of Midnight in Peking and many other good works, said, you know, Brian, the policy stories of the Mekong are all known and well told, and people kind of know what the elites of these countries of the Mekong want. And, you know, they sing the praises of how highways and bridges and dams are going to drive development forward and solve everything for everyone. But that might not be the story of what's happening on the ground. So can you put together a book that tells the stories of underrepresented people, of communities that are being affected by, say, upstream dams or climate change or high-speed railways that are running through their backyards? And let us know what the pulse of the region is. And so that's what I tried to do with this book. And it's done in a way that is there and very palatable for the general reader. You know, if you read The New Yorker, you're the reader I had in mind for this particular book. So it's not a policy book. It's not a travelogue, as it has been described as. But John Swain, in this really amazing Wall Street Journal review that happened a few weeks ago, and I was very surprised and delighted to have a Wall Street Journal review of my book. He said the book is like a travelogue, and I like that. I use ethnographic methods, visiting communities over and over during time to gain their trust and to get what I believe is, you know, local knowledge and true information, and to establish a relationship with these people. And, you know, in this part of the world, telling the stories of people that are being affected by what's going on around them isn't always easy. So I tried to use the do no harm principle, and in many parts of the book, despite the fact that some people do have names in here, some of those names have been changed to protect them, particularly those who are interviewed in the Tibetan parts of China. Yes, there are Tibetan parts of the Mekong, and those in Laos particularly. And I interviewed over 200 people for this book, and about 100 of them are profiled in it. So let's jump right to the Mekong itself. And when I think about the Mekong itself, there are many ways you can talk about the Mekong. Some think of the greater Mekong, right? That it's all of Yunnan province and all of Myanmar and all of Thailand. And I think of the basin. So when we talk about the Mekong tonight, we're going to talk about the watershed. That's every part of this landscape here where water touches and eventually ends up into the mainstream of the Mekong and then comes out of the mouth of the Mekong Delta. Many of you know that the Mekong rises high in the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau in China. Half of its length flows through China, but the bottom half is where most of the watershed is. And that's because there are these great rivers, the great rivers of Asia, flow alongside of the Mekong in China's portion of the Mekong. You've got the Yangtze River to one side, the Irrawaddy River to another. The Red River is close by, flowing there into Hanoi. The Salween in between the Irrawaddy and the Mekong. And they're all competing for space in these deep valleys of southwestern China. And as they leave these deep valleys, the watersheds begin to fan out. The other way that I think about the Mekong is origins. So the water might originate from China. The sediment, which is very important for underpinning the fish population of the Mekong, as well as agricultural productivity in Cambodia, Laos, and particularly the Mekong Delta. But origins of life and the resources of the Mekong happen throughout the basin. And nowhere is there a better origin than the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia. And it's this yearly rhythm of flooding and draining the lake that produces the world's largest inland fish catch. And we'll talk about that later tonight. Something really, truly mighty. That uniqueness of having this lake at the bottom of the river system that's driving life forward is something that I believe makes this system mighty. Something else that makes this system mighty is the amazing patchwork of humanity that lives within upland Southeast Asia, that lives in Southeast Asia and Southwest China, within the basin and outside of the basin. So each color here represents a different ethnic group. And these colors are divided by language groups. So you can see just among linguistic differences, it's huge. There are hundreds of different groups that are identified as official ethnic groups in Southwest China and mainland Southeast Asia here. And what's really neat about these groups is where they live. The greatest variety of ethnic diversity is inside a line that is drawn at about 300 meters or 1,000 feet around this part of the world. So there's something going on that has allowed this ethnic diversity to blossom. Some anthropologists call this region Somya. Some of you might be familiar with the work of James Scott and those anthropologists before him that started to explore this idea of Somya. And the idea is that if you know the history of Southeast Asia, you know that the Thai Empire, the Vietnamese, and many other of the major lowland groups are those that wandered out of China over the millennia and down into Southeast Asia, where they met the Mon and the Khmer and began to compete with them for space. So much so that the Zhuang people here in Southwest China, in Guangxi, can have a conversation with folks in Bangkok, with Thai, the high Thai elite here in Bangkok. You can have this conversation and get by. And you can watch the language migrate down through the Mekong Basin into Lanna in northern Thailand, and then all the way to Bangkok. But some of the groups that weren't as arguably successful as the Thai, the Siamese Empire, wandered into these resource-rich areas. And they were moving at times when China's empire is expanding and shedding off people, or collapsing and shedding off people, right, that are running away from what's happening. Those people who did not want to engage with the expanding Chinese empire and did not want to be assimilated and to become Han Chinese, and they ran for the hills, and they stayed there. They found resource abundance, food resources, relative isolation, so that they could define a new life for themselves. And those that are Somya scholars draw some commonalities of the people within that gray line. That they tend to be groups that are anarchic. They avoid the state. They avoid being governed by lowlanders. They don't plant lowland rice. They plant upland rice. They avoid paying taxes at the utmost. And They don't bury their dead in graveyards. They tend to not be stuck to their land, because if the state shows up, they've got to move. So these are groups that are kind of always on the move. And that snapshot that I showed you earlier, you can imagine that as being quite fluid, particularly at a point when borders were still very fluid. Another commonality of these groups is that they tend to collect high-value products from the forests and the plains around them. Non-timber forest products, to use an anthropological term, that are low in weight and high in value, that are really worth marching down out of the hills to sell in lowland marketplaces. And these groups can then use the income from that trade to kind of keep distance from the state. And again, invent and create their own ethnic identity, picking up the pieces from what's around them culturally. So at the top, these are Yunnanese high-value gathered and foraged products like the cordyceps, the caterpillar fungus, it's also known as. One of these good for what ails you, especially for men, products. That will fetch up to $600 a pound on the market in China. Down here is the matsutake mushroom, which is highly sought after in this city, but also in Tokyo more particularly. So it can be harvested on day one, and by the evening of day two, it could be served up in high-end restaurants in Tokyo. The most popular upland crop of this part of the world is what? Opium, right. That product that is low mass, high value, and it's worth marching down out of the hills. And it is a crop that has driven livelihoods and supported those livelihoods, for better or for worse, up in these hills for the longest time. And these groups were allowed, their cultures, their identities stayed the way they were in many ways because, again, the state didn't have roads, didn't have the airplanes, didn't have the telecom technology to get up and antagonize them up in the hills until now, right? So this is the Xiaowan Dam. It's one of the largest dams in the world. It's the third highest dam in the world in terms of wall height. It's about 1,000 feet high. It produces a ton of electricity. It was the third dam to be completed on China's portion of the Mekong, and its storage capacity is 1/4 of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, I typically give this talk in Washington, so those people in Washington understand the size of the Chesapeake Bay. It's a lot of water, okay? It's a lot of water. And this dam itself caused the displacement of about 100,000 people. And I'm sorry, I got to get my numbers straight, about 40,000 people. And so it's in this part of Somya that the state could previously not penetrate. And having these technologies come in and these investments come in is moving people around and changing their cultural milieu. And it's a purposed policy goal to kind of get people out of the hills and build them into an industrial labor force so they can modernize and be part of a modern economy. So if we draw these lines again, the ethnic patchwork is inside of this. And now let's put the plans for dams or dams that are operated or under construction in here. And you can see that for this ethnic patchwork, if it's moving around and causing people to be resettled and rethink and recreate their identities and conform to these lowland modern methods, their days are numbered. So this is a form of the Mekong's mightiness that is going away. In China, is under threat, and I think is very likely going away, more towards more homogenization. And I write about this in the book, particularly through the lens of the Aka people that are found in Yunnan, that are found in Myanmar, in northern Thailand, northern Vietnam, and northern Laos. So let's talk about dams in China. This is a map that shows Sichuan province, Yunnan, and eastern Tibet. Now, each of these provinces could build out about 100 gigawatts of hydroelectric assets, of dams. The United States, where I live, its hydropower fleet is 100 gigawatts. So we could get 3 United States worth of hydropower out of this watershed alone. The dark green dots are those dams that are completed, the light green are those under construction, and orange are those that are part of a plan or a pipeline of projects. And you can see China's engineers are just moving up the rivers, right? building out these dams. There are now 11 dams completed on China's portion of the upper Mekong. It's a dam builder's dream. There are low numbers of people, low population density, steep mountain valleys that are perfect for an engineering perspective to draw up a big wall, create an amazing amount of hydraulic pressure that can generate a lot of electricity. The power generation for the Mekong, upper Mekong alone, is about 31 gigawatts. I mean, this is a lot more than what, say, Laos can produce if it were to build all of its dams. It costs $17 billion, relocation. For 11 dams, this size is, you could kind of see that it's not that risky or expensive of an operation. Excuse me. But what's interesting about this map is that Yunnan province, the dams in Yunnan alone on all these rivers are way over capacity right now. So they're wasting power. So much so that in 2017, Yunnan province wasted the same amount of power that Thailand consumed. All right, that 60-some million people here in Thailand consumed. And that means that the water was curtailed. It was sent out through the floodgates rather than through the turbines, because you can't keep a reservoir static, right? You've got other water coming in, you've got to let the water out, particularly in the part of the world where there's a monsoon pulse that hits it each year. In 2015, there was a lot of excess capacity, $15 million in losses each day. All the dams on this map total about 180 gigawatts. In the provinces at large, you can get up to 300. But in the lower Mekong, there's something quite different. First of all, I think that all these dams that are on this map will get built because China's committed to building them. It's a very simple, one company per river will build out each of these dams. In the lower Mekong, the situation is much more complex. Multiple countries, weak countries like Laos and Cambodia, that are kind of put in a passive position for foreign developers to come in and build dams within their own territory. On this map, there are over 150 dots, same convention. Dark green are those dams that are completed, light green those that are under construction, orange are those that are part of a pipeline or a plan. And you can see there's a big difference between Laos and Cambodia. Cambodia has a lot more orange unbuilt dams than Laos does. Laos wants to become the battery of Southeast Asia. To many of you, this is not new news. This has been a priority for Laos for more than a decade, if not longer. And the idea for Laos is that it can utilize its portion of the watershed to generate a lot of electricity to meet regional demand, to sell that power to Thailand, to sell that power to Vietnam. And surely, to date, Thailand has been the biggest purchaser, off-taker of power from Laos. And this way, Laos can generate enough income, hard currency, and foreign currency to boot, that it can use to kind of stave off macroeconomic challenges, to hold on and become and be a resilient state. Otherwise, there are very few options for Laos economic development in the eyes of the Lao elite. Or maybe they're just in it for the Lamborghinis. In Cambodia, something else is happening. Well, before I get to Cambodia, I do want to say that these projects in Laos are all being built on a project-by-project approach. So there's no plan, there's no blueprint. And this is part of the problem. We don't know in the end how many dams will be built. So someone like me who works on this issue that predicts and looks at impacts downstream, it's really hard to say what the final impacts are going to be. We know it's going to be bad, but we don't know how bad it's going to be. And that puts the entire system at risk without a particular plan moving forward. Cambodia has been slower to build its dams, and I think for a very good reason. It's because it is known that this Tonle Sap Lake is an important contributor to Cambodia's economy and to food security needs. And so dams are being built out slower there. Now, one thing you might not know is that the way that the Tonle Sap works is when the monsoon season comes around, right? We're starting up now and getting into June, more and more rain is coming down, rainwater coming down through the system from China through Laos. These tributaries are collecting water. These 3 tributaries here contribute about 20% of the Mekong system. They're called the 3S rivers. And by the time that this water comes down close to Phnom Penh, water begins to spill over into the Tonle Sap's floodplain. And when it gets to Phnom Penh, at the confluence of the river that drains out of the Tonle Sap, so much water gathers there that it reverses the direction of that river, sending 70 times the amount of water back into that lake than is there in the dry season. It's a real natural miracle. Nowhere else on Earth does this. The lake's footprint expands 5 times its size during the dry season. And then when the dry season comes again, it contracts year on year. There's this rhythmic expansion and contraction of the Tonle Sap Lake. It brings in water, it brings in sediment, it brings in organic material, fish larvae, and lots of fish eggs. And what happens in there is there's this explosion of life that feeds off of what's coming into the lake. And it produces the world's largest inland fish catch. So that lake alone will have an annual catch of about 500,000 tons. The entire Mekong system produces up to 2.6 million tons of fish. So we look at countries, we look at continents. All of North America's rivers and lakes combined only produce 160,000 tons of fish, freshwater caught fish. This is an impressive system. This is what really makes the Mekong mighty. And it comes about as a result of a connected system of all the tributaries contributing to that pressure to produce this annual reversal of the Tonle Sap River backing up into the Tonle Sap Lake. This is a point of view picture that I took, one in the dry season, another in the wet season, in a fishing village along the lake. There can be as much of a 9-meter stage difference year on year. And the rule of thumb is the higher the floods, the more fish will be caught. Now, in my book, I go through great lengths to explain how this all works. So you get more than the rule of thumb in the book. But this fish catch feeds the Cambodians with 70% of their protein intake. It also draws people together along the lakeside each year so that protein can be transferred from fresh fish intake to preserved and eaten into the dry season through something called prahok. And many of you know what prahok is. It's fermented fish paste that's created through processing these smaller fish called cyprinids, gathering groups of communities along the lakeside for untold centuries, and forming an important cross-cutting tie that keeps communities together, that keeps this tradition going. The process is to take these and put them into vats and then put salt on them and let them sit for a couple days. And if you've seen this, you've also smelled it. And you know that it's not the finest smelling aroma. But it is a way for Cambodians, and the Lao do it as well, and the Isan and the Isan Thai do it, to continue to consume protein into a portion of the year where it's not as readily available. The Mekong is also filled with large fish, and lots of them. The numbers are quite unknown exactly how many species of fish are in the Mekong, but somewhere around 1,000 is what's typically talked about, and most of them are migratory to some extent. This is the giant Mekong catfish. It can be as long as this table up here and weigh as much as 350 kilograms. And this is one of the last large Mekong giant catfish caught in 2013, and it ended up in a restaurant down here. Maybe it was served at the FCCT, I don't know. Another one of these high-value products coming out of the Mekong. Since then, the fish has been put on IUCN's endangered red list, species list, and that, along with species like the Mekong giant barb, the Irrawaddy dolphin, of which there are maybe only 90 left in Cambodia, near the Cambodia-Laos border, are indicator species of a very robust ecosystem below them that supports their population. And their numbers are decreasing year on year. In my book, I talk about some successful fish conservation efforts throughout the Mekong in a couple different communities. And I think fish conservation can work, but fish conservation is hard to keep going in the face of upstream dam impacts, which have profound impacts on downstream habitats, as well as in the face of climate change impacts, which are coming down the pike rather quickly. So as I said at the beginning, I promised to write a book that tells the stories and represents voices of underrepresented people. So tonight I want to share some of those stories from the Mekong, and I've got 3 of them, and then I'll conclude and we'll have some discussion. So these stories are going to start from the Golden Triangle, and the first is of a figure who shows up several times in my book. He's a good friend of mine who has some news today on this particular day, which I think is really impressive, and we'll get there at the end of his story. But his name is Gruti. Niwat Roykal is his real name, but in Thailand he's known and revered as Gruti. He's here in this town of Chiang Khong in Thailand in the Golden Triangle. And I think of him as kind of the old man of the Mekong. He is a community activist. He gathers farmers from the surrounding communities to teach them of ways to sustainably farm using both traditional and modern methods, a combination of these so that they can maintain their livelihoods. He also has a school called the Mekong School, where he gathers these farmers to exchange this information. He'll hold lectures for visiting college students. He's had consultations for downstream dams there. One of China's dam builders showed up there at the Mekong School one day. And when I met him and interviewed him for this book, he told me about a time when he was young in the 1960s. And he remembered a time when the river was teeming with fish, and fishermen would pull out armloads of fish each day to bring home to the home for dinner each night. And during the colder months of the year, he would have to kind of sidle up beside his grandfather and compete for space with his brothers and sisters, because his grandfather had the sleeping space beside the home fire. He was the one who was most respected, so Gruti could keep warm too. And when he was doing this and he was successful, he would hear stories from his grandfather of the giant Bulla Hung, who is a spirit legend of the Golden Triangle. And my own personal interpretation of Bulla Hung is he's kind of like a Paul Bunyan-esque character. But instead of cutting down the forests of northern the United States, he was the steward of the Golden Triangle, battling off evil spirits and outside invaders. Mountains and rivers were created from Bulla Hung's footprints as he moved through the land. And just as Paul Bunyan raised Babe the Blue Ox to be a giant beast, Bulla Hung raised the fish of the Mekong to be plentiful and gigantic, and to provide for those who live near the river. Where Bulla Hung rested, he created flat land, and he taught the people of the Mekong how to plant rice and paddies and build fish traps. As he was telling me this story, he was also telling me how he each year would build statues, the giant marionette statues that you often see in Isan or in Laos, that are paraded through the streets during important festivals, and they're used to teach morality plays, often to younger people. And he was telling me that it's important for him to use the Bulla Hung legend to teach children how the ecosystem of the Mekong works. And we were talking about another issue, and that is of the blasting of the rapids in Gruti's backyard that would allow for the passage of large ships. And I'm going to get back to this really quickly, but he's very active on gathering community protesters to get out on these rocks that prevent the passage of large ships from China down into the Thai-Lao border. We were talking about Bulla Hung, and I make the suggestion that, we talk a lot about dams. Maybe during this year's morality play, the marionette Bulla Hung could encounter a dam in the road, and he could kick it down. And Gruti's eyes light up, and he says, "Yes, Bulla Hung kicks the dam. We will do this." And he proceeds to spread the idea to others sitting around the table. And though I reminded him that China is now regrouping its efforts to destroy the shoals to allow for the passage of those large ships. And he says, hey, no worry. This time we will have Bulla Hung behind us, and we'll go out there and stop them. And if Bulla Hung can kick the dam, then Bulla Hung can stop the Chinese. And I'm happy to say that International Rivers today released a press report saying that this rapids blasting program is now over, that Gruti won his fight against not having these rapids blasted. And that came as in the form of a letter from Thailand's foreign minister to his group, confirming a conversation that Thailand's foreign minister had with China's foreign minister. So it looks good. It's on writing. At least something is in writing. Let's continue to wait and see, though. But, strike up a small victory for community activism for Gruti and his crew in northern Thailand. There are ways to push back. A second story comes from northern Laos, in and around Luang Prabang. Who's been to Luang Prabang? Hopefully everybody here. Great. Very few, when I'm doing my talk in the U.S., have raised their hands. Luang Prabang is the jewel of Southeast Asia. It's the place you've got to go to before the high-speed rail changes everything. The gilded Buddhist temples and the refurbished French villas that serve some of the best Lao food in all the world, and some of the best French food in all the world. And you can also get one of the Asia's highest-ranked croissants in one of the cafes there, right? It's some place to go before it does change. Just upstream from Luang Prabang is where the U River flows into the Mekong mainstream. You might have taken the boat up to the famous Buddhist caves there and see the U flowing into the mainstream across the way here. Chinese dam developer Power China, also known as Sinohydro, has built 7 dams on this cascade. 3 of them are completed, 4 of them are under construction. And it's turned once one of the most beautiful and remote and connected rivers and longest tributaries of the Mekong into a dead river system. And it's displaced thousands of local ethnic peoples. So my team one day decided to go and learn about and observe how people are getting along, those who have been resettled. And we were driving down the road and came across one of these resettlement villages from the Nam U 2 Dam. And as we were approaching, we saw this off in the distance, the village with the red homes, very nicely laid out resettlement village, homes that were large, and a lot of activity, community activity, milling around within this village. And I thought perhaps this is an example of a good case study of resettlement where livelihoods have been restored. We found something different. After we parked our van, and without any solicitation, a woman approached us and said, "We are suffering. We were forced to move here 18 months ago, and the dam company promised 2 years of funding for transitional assistance. So far, we've only received enough money to cover 6 months. We don't have enough to eat." I quickly inquired with her whether she and the other villagers were given land on which to plant agricultural crops. No, the company only offered land for the house and provided no fields for planting rice. This was their number one form of economic activity and of deriving an important food crop. "We have no money, so we must walk back to our old fields and forests by the flooded village. We're old, and it takes us a few hours to walk there." She continued, "If we want to plant rice or other crops around the resettlement village, we must rent land from the village next to us. Since we have no income, some villagers who rent land have gone into debt. They are forced to leave the village if they can't repay. They're forced to leave the village if they can't repay. In our old village, very few people had the need to borrow money. Now more than half of these villagers are in deep debt." My colleague inquired with her about health issues in the village. "As soon as we moved here, many of the village elders died," she said. "This was not normal. They were aging, but they were healthy. And since moving here, 5 infants have died. This also rarely happened in our village. We're not able to take care of each other like we used to." So what I thought previously might have been a positive example of resettlement quickly revealed itself as one of induced poverty, one where day to day these unfortunate people were becoming worse and worse off. And I walked around the village and met some more people. I came across a woman who was standing outside of her home, and she said, "Look at the side of my home. See how termites are eating the side of this building? The Chinese used the cheapest wood they could find to build those homes, and we will likely need to rebuild them in a few years." When I suggested that the dam company could reuse the teak from their homes in the flooded village to build new homes, she replied, "The Chinese took our teak boards and took them back to China to sell on the market." Another woman that I was talking to was telling me about the gardens. And those of you who live in this part of the world know that there are the pantry gardens around homes in rural communities where you grow chili peppers and eggplants and basil and all the things that go into the day-to-day construction of Thai and Lao cuisine. She said, "When we moved here, we planted gardens alongside the house, but now they are dead. The dam company used hard soil to make the resettlement village. It's just not fertile." Her home was located alongside the river, so we walked down a steep path to the river's edge. She said, "In our old village, accessing the river was easy. We could bathe, we could swim, and go for picnics on a sandy beach. Now we cannot even fish because this part of the river belongs to the village next to us." More and more stories like this revealed themselves during the days that we were there. And before we left, the woman who met us first with the complaint, "We are suffering," she left us with these parting words: "Come again. You're always welcome to tour our poverty." So a third story, actually a set of stories, can't all be that bad, right? Comes from the Mekong Delta. So we're going to go to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, a piece of the basin that's roughly the size of the country of Denmark, an area, or the state of West Virginia, where 17 million people live and produce an amazing amount of agricultural crops. 50% of Vietnam's rice export comes from the Delta, 70% of Vietnam's fruit, 70% of Vietnam's aquaculture, fish and shrimp export comes out of the Mekong Delta. And Vietnam, in terms of rice, trades off with Thailand and India year on year for the #1 top world rice exporter. Life in the Delta is very much unlike life in the rest of the basin. Mostly everyone in the Delta, for one thing, it's highly densely populated. So about 450 people per square kilometer, 17 million people. We go up one country upstream, right? All of Cambodia doesn't have that for a population. And we go upstream even farther to Laos with 6 million. So very different social milieu there. Life is very much on the water. Cars are less common than, say, boats and motorcycles. And crops and markets grew up on the rivers of the Mekong Delta. There's these floating markets. You can still go see them today. Many of them have become tourist attractions, but some of them are still in use for locals. And vendors will come out in the morning, or farmers, and they'll string up whatever they're selling on a pole, and that's the advertisement. Come and get my cauliflower. The Delta itself, I argue, and I think I put together a pretty convincing historical argument, has been transformed into one of the most over-engineered spaces on Earth. So it's unlike any other portion of the Mekong, which has yet to be over-engineered, okay? And this has been done through building canals, irrigation systems, dikes, and sluice gates that effectively control where water goes, keeping water out of places where the Vietnamese government or the market doesn't want it to go, and sending it to places where it's needed. This is something that the Vietnamese learned from the Americans who were there before the new state of Vietnam came about, and the Americans learned it from the French before them. And the Vietnamese, before the French, were also building lots of canals. This landscape has been transformed into an entirely disconnected landscape from the water around it. It is not free-flowing, it is not wild, it's managed and it's controlled. And it's there, by and large, to produce a lot of rice. So portions of the Mekong Delta now produce 3 crops of rice per year. And those of you who know agriculture know this is very impressive. But that triple rice crop comes at a high cost. It used to grow very well, very easily because of the rich soil of the delta. But if water and sediments in the river system can't replenish that soil on a yearly basis, the quality of that soil becomes worse and worse each year. So now to get more rice, or the same amount of rice out of the same amount of land, you've got to bring in outside inputs, fertilizers, pesticides to keep it going. And this becomes a very costly proposition for those that are stuck inside these entirely controlled spaces. Some of them have transitioned to the yellow portion of this map. That's shrimp production, a higher value product coming out of the Mekong Delta. And something like 50% of America's supermarkets carry shrimp from the Mekong Delta. That means Americans far away also consume what's happening in the Mekong. Others, though, just pick up with their feet and move to work in factories in Ho Chi Minh City. So over the last 10 years, 1 million people have left the Mekong Delta. In 2017, 300,000 people left the Mekong Delta. It is an economic landscape that is becoming farther and farther behind what the rest of Vietnam is doing. In addition to that, there are these ecological threats that hound the delta day to day, year on year. So salinity intrusion is a tidal force that, as the sea level rises, brings more salt water deeper and deeper into that delta, forcing farmers to rethink the crops that they plant or rethink the livelihoods that they are carrying out. Sea level rise over a long period of time will also turn the delta into what has been described as a series of islands or lace, or we just really don't know what it's going to look like if these scenarios do play out over time. And we don't know what it's going to look like for the reason of, one, all these upstream dams hold back the builders of the delta, right? The sediment and the dirt in the system that should be keeping the Mekong Delta forcing itself out into the ocean. That's just not happening. And if the dams weren't there, it still wouldn't happen, because the floods that used to send water all the way across the delta and replenish that land are not happening due to this controlled system. And to make matters worse, farmers who have less access to fresh water are drawing up water from underground aquifers. And what this does is, well, you live in Bangkok, which is also an incredibly sinking city, causes the land to sink. So sea level rise is coming in at about 3 millimeters per year. In portions of the delta, land is sinking at 3 centimeters per year as a result of groundwater extraction and land subsidence. So that's an order of magnitude higher, and these things work together to disintegrate and to chip away at the delta's resilience and make even greater challenges for people living there. So to my story, and this will be my last story, there's profiles of 2 people, and then we'll wrap up and do a discussion. I jumped on the back of a motorcycle with a friend of mine, Professor Nguyen Mun Diep, who works at Can Tho University. And Can Tho University, if you follow this, is kind of filled with some of the world's best Mekong experts and the most active activists and advocates and academics working hard on promoting a sustainable pathway forward for the Mekong basin as a whole, and particularly for the delta. So Professor Nguyen and I went to an island at the end of the Mekong. And before we interviewed people, I said, let's go to the end of the Mekong. Let's find the beach, right? And let's see where the river goes into the ocean. So we're going down a road on this island in the middle of the Mekong towards the mouth, and we get stuck in a sugarcane field. And we come out of the sugarcane field, and there's no beach. But there's a kilometer of mangroves, thick trees that are impenetrable. So no beach, but we got a lot of mangroves. And those mangroves are really important also for holding back the encroaching ocean and the storms and things that menace the land of the delta. So we didn't get the beach picture, but we stopped for a coffee at a small cafe on the island, and we met a man named Nguyen Mun Diep, who was a sugarcane farmer. And he had a farm the size of 180 acres. So I give this talk in Washington. I say it's about half the size of the Washington Mall, a large farm. growing sugarcane. And he told us that we wanted to learn about his challenges of having, salinity intrusion in his backyard and sea level rise and more intense weather, how things were going for him. And he said, we used to grow rice here in the past, but we do so no longer. The land around here is young and it used to be underwater, so it has a high toxicity content. We'll talk about that later. Rice just won't grow. People on the island have shifted to other crops like sugarcane, taro, chili, or pumpkins. And for those who are rich, those who have money, they can dig out shrimp farms. But many people here are poor, so they don't have the ability to do that. He said, like most people here on the island, I plant sugarcane, but it's hard to find workers to harvest my crop, since the young generation tends to go to Ho Chi Minh City to work in factories. There's a huge shortage of workers here. Low number of workers means the wages are high, and that's the problem. I can't hire anyone to harvest my crop. The price of sugarcane this year is very low, making it even worse. I have no income. Many of the farmers here have no income because we get less than what we invested into the farm. We're very disappointed. I asked him whether he could shift and transition into producing higher value shrimp, and he said, I'm too old for this. Anyway, to become a shrimp farmer, I'd have to surrender my land deed over to the bank to get a loan. Half of my friends who have gone into shrimping have failed, and after that they lose their land and have no choice but to work in factories. This is a gamble I'm not willing to take. So now I drive a motorcycle taxi, and that's why I'm here waiting at this cafe. 180 hectares of land, and he's eking out a living of $1,000 a year, unable to harvest his fields. We left Mr. Zepp and went to meet another man named, who I call in the book Mr. Tan. And Mr. Tan was very, very enthusiastic about showing us his farm. Mr. Tan lives on a half hectare of land, a much smaller farm than what Mr. Zepp had. And in his backyard, he showed us 2 ponds surrounded by mangrove trees that were filled with carp, tilapia, snails, and floating plants that he called water lettuce. Surrounding the ponds in his home are 80 fruit trees, bearing grapefruit, durian, and mangtang fruit, which is a tart, lychee-like fruit found in the hotter climes of Southeast Asia. And he just had to climb up in the tree. He's like 70 years old, and pull some fruit down for us to try, and it was really good. Every product from his farm would qualify as organic. His system is entirely closed, meaning he brings in nothing from outside of his farm. No pesticides, no fertilizers, no antibiotics to maintain its productivity. The fish and the snails, they eat the lettuce for nutrition, he tells us. And all the fish are herbivores, so they will not eat the snails. My snails are the top quality snails in all of the Mekong Delta. And the best restaurants in Kanto City want them. And he tells us this as he pulls a few snails. You can see they're quite large, the size of golf balls, off of the water lettuce that he removes from the pond. And then he takes more of that water lettuce and he puts it into a wheelbarrow. And he wheels it over to this contraption that has a hole on one end and is long, and he starts shoving the water lettuce into this hole. What is this? I'll turn it over to get you guys talking. It's something he's very proud of. He says, this is my biodigester. It produces all the gas I need to cook food day to day. And in the dry season, on the hottest days, I can use it to generate electricity to run my air conditioner. So particularly when the price of electricity is high, right? He can generate this methane gas. So what happens is there's a fermentation process at the end that causes methane to form. It's not a very complex system, and it sends gas up into a bladder where it is stored and then eventually ends up in his home for use. He's really proud of his biodigester. And he says, every year, college students from the University of Minnesota come here to learn my methods, and I teach them how to build a biodigester. Professor Nguyen added to us, Tan's fruit grows at different times of the year, and his fish and his snails can be harvested at any time. So he's not like a rice or shrimp farmer who only collects income a few times a year. On average, he earns between $5,000 and $6,000 a year, which is very impressive for a half hectare of land when you compare Mr. Ziep's 180 hectares of land that he essentially has no income from. I turn to Mr. Tan and I say, you seem to enjoy this, but maintaining the system seems like a lot of work. And he looks at me with a smile and says, I really enjoy this, and it's not a lot of work. And now the system can take care of itself. Sometimes I don't have to tend to it for weeks. And during his free time, what does he do? He travels around the Delta teaching other farmers how to build these closed-loop polyculture systems, making even more money doing that. So Mr. Tan represents innovation, right? Taking what's around him, what's coming in from around the world, and learning about new technologies, and putting them to use for his own benefit, and for the benefit of others. And in the Delta, I think we can look at stories of the present, similar to Mr. Ziep, that you'll find stories like his throughout the rest of the Mekong Basin, where farmers' livelihoods are being challenged and they're struggling to cope and adapt. But also, the Mekong Delta represents the future of the basin, future innovation, ways forward for those that live here. Also, it represents the future of the basin because what's happening now in the Delta is the Vietnamese government are committed to transitioning away from rice first, from this triple rice cropping policy, and restoring the natural ecosystem qualities of the Mekong Delta, tearing some of these dikes down, experimenting on how fast this can be done, to allow the floods to exist once more, to allow the sediment to be distributed, to build a more resilient landscape in the face of these climate change changes, and also to promote higher value agricultural products. And this came after a period of about 2.5 decades where an engineering project came in to promote economic development that didn't work out for that landscape in the long term. Upstream, 180 dams are coming in at a similar pace. How long will it take for the countries and the stakeholders within, decision makers within Laos and Cambodia and China to realize that this is a development pathway that isn't paying off for them? And how much of the mightiness of the Mekong will be lost in that process before a transition point comes? That's my talk, everybody. Thanks for being a great audience, and look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks, Brian. I think that was absolutely fascinating, and I can recommend, having read the book, I can say those little stories are just so, they bring the whole thing alive, and you capture people so well. But, overall, I think the picture that emerges when you talk, and also from the title, is very stark, right. Extremely stark, and yet, as you yourself say, I think in the book, that the average person along the Mekong has never been healthier, more educated, or relatively better off than today. Right. So having said that, we're confronted with the title, which is, as I said, not even a question, it's a statement. It's almost like these are the last days. However, reading your stories, there are more than a few glimmers of hope, I suppose you could say, in all those little stories and people fighting, and the ingenuity, innovation, and, as you said, people being better off today than before. So how hopeless do you feel about the whole thing? I mean, I think in the book you're not really saying that it's irreparable and these are the final days. I guess you've been asked this before, but perhaps you could tell us, how optimistic are you about the solutions, or that governments will wake up to it? Or?
Right. Well, I mean, this is what I do on a day-to-day basis. We work on Mekong policy options and smart solutions for alternative development options, and I'm still doing it. So are others. So we do see ways forward for the Mekong. And we see ways to extend these last days if we are in those last days. I do think that if you think about dam development, I don't want to say we're at early days, but only 2 dams are being built on the mainstream of the Mekong, and these tend to be the worst and most damaging projects for the mainstream. And there are 2 more under consideration, or 2 more that have gone through the process of being, the consultation process is related to the Mekong River Commission's mandate. And at the same time, the productivity of the Tonle Sap really hasn't kind of petered off. In fact, last year, the flood height of the Tonle Sap Lake was the highest in recent memory, according to what locals told us. And it went down to an extreme low during the dry season. That's what you need to produce that massive fish catch. So the regulatory effects on the river system that are predicted to change the Tonle Sap's productivity really haven't translated through yet. And I think there is some hope. The market for alternatives to hydropower is coming online really quickly in Thailand as well as Vietnam, a little bit more slowly in the places where it really matters, Laos and Cambodia, but still moving forward there. So there's a conversation that we can have with decision makers in these countries about replacing some of those dams. If it's really about electricity generation, we'll think of other ways to generate that electricity. And then maybe there are ways to conserve some of these resources. But as far as the ethnic patchwork of upland Southeast Asia goes, I think we're on a short horizon for losing that. And that gradually looking at patterns of out-migration from these communities and villages and young people being kind of homogenized into lowland Thai culture or becoming, very much like the Han Chinese teenagers beside them. This is something that we're not going to get back.
No, but there is a natural, as we're seeing in rural communities throughout Asia, which is there's a natural aspiration amongst young people they don't want to, grow pick snails or, grow rice like their parents did. Yeah. They want to be in the city. So I'm not sure how much of it is due to the kind of environmental issues.
Well, no, I think it's due to the fact that there are paved roads that go into the villages now. It's really easy to get down to wherever they want to go. They can buy an iPhone, and they can be on their iPhone all day long, and that's accessing the rest of the world, right? And the information of the rest of the world, and they're being exposed to everything that we're exposed to. And sure, there's an aspiration there. But one thing that I found with communities, particularly along the Tonle Sap, there are a lot of floating communities there that are on boats that float in the lake, is that because resources still are relatively abundant, and there's a high cost related to moving to Phnom Penh to work in a factory, and there's a lot of uncertainty related to that. The young people there would rather stay in their villages. And you still see populations along the lake growing. Not growing as fast as, say, Phnom Penh is, which is one of the fastest growing cities in all of Southeast Asia, but still on the up and up.
Right.
So I think it matters, the resource base matters for the choice to migrate or not.
Interesting. And one other thing before we turn to questions, because I suppose this sort of just as you were finalising the book, but the tragic dam collapse last year in Laos, we're still not 100% sure whether it was just shoddy construction or whether it was mismanagement of the flows and things. What was your view on that?
So I had sent this manuscript in on July 5th.
Right.
And then that happened.
Right.
And I think
July
23rd of last year.
We still don't even know how many died, really, seriously.
The number's somewhere around 70. It's definitely not in the hundreds or thousands from some reliable sources that I talked to, but thousands were displaced. And like the other resettlement village in Laos that I talked about, this is a situation where livelihoods are worse and worse off day to day. From what we hear, that those camps it's a really sad situation. If this goes into second print, and I think it will, because we're already we're really far halfway through the first run. For a prologue, I think I'll talk about that dam burst. And yeah, this sent a signal, I think a chilling signal throughout Laos. I just got an email yesterday from one of Laos' top planning officials who said that right now we're going through a deep inspection of dam projects. So much so that it's hard for us to think about bringing on new projects. And as a result of that dam burst last year. Well, so these are things that slow down the process. And I do believe that the studies have now come out that showed that shoddy material was used to create that support dam that ended up bursting in order to cut corners and save money for the dam company.
Right, but that was a Korean construction company,
Korean-Thai
right.
joint venture.
Yeah, so one thing we can't blame blame on the Chinese.
China had nothing to do with that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, good luck. I hope you can get near the area because journalists were not able to...
I don't think anyone can get near that right now.
Still.
Well, Philip Alstom, the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, did visit that area. And in his report, this was a couple months ago, he pulled no punches and made a very clear argument that there's a connection between poverty and continued poverty and large mega infrastructure projects, that they are drivers of poverty in Laos and not something that are bringing locals out of poverty.
Right. Well, that's an extremely controversial view, but anyway, well...
Yeah, he pulled no punches.
Right. Interesting. Questions? Please identify yourself.
George Lerner, someone.
Hi, George.
Yeah. I was wondering what the influence of James C. Scott and seeing like a state was for you, considering the feral societies and the types of people he was also studying. I was also wondering what you learned about China's use of creating dams, especially those outside of Southeast Asia, since they also construct dams that I've seen everywhere from the Caucasus to the Middle East.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they learned a lot of lessons, and they're also creating these dams in very poor areas, and the people are also becoming very poor. And I wondered, it's correct that you're teaching at Yunnan University?
I used to teach that.
I was just wondering what the influence of teaching in a university like that in China had on your research. Thanks.
Sure. So James Scott, who has kind of popularized the theory, the idea of Somya, had a huge influence on the way that I think about this part of the world. And what I connected most with reading his seminal book, The Art of Not Being Governed, where he lays out this theory, is I was reading it while I was in Yunnan province and taking American college students up into the hills and interacting with ethnic peoples there and seeing what he's writing about all around us. Now he posits that Somya as an idea, as this unifying region, is something that went away in the 1950s. When roads could be paved and helicopters could menace those in the hills and things like that. But I discovered something different, that a lot of those common traits of the peoples of upland Southeast Asia that kind of make them more like themselves than lowlanders were still there. And there are a lot of discontents with Somya. There are people who say that it's a flawed idea. But as a way for unifying and thinking about upland Southeast Asia, there's a lot to say for it. The one question, I think I did answer your second question, but I do want to say that despite China's dams in Yunnan province being at excess capacity, remember Yunnan wasted as much power as what Thailand consumed, they continue to be built. And there's a lot of questions as to why that is. So in the book I talk about how climate change might factor into this, and how the Himalayan glaciers are warming faster than any other frozen part of the world, and they're melting fast as well. And those large storage dams can catch that water. That water needs to be released downstream, right? 'Cause this is not a static system, or it could be sent someplace else. So for China, being one of the most water-scarce countries in the world per capita, there might be some creative engineers out there someday that would think, hey, there's got to be a way to get that water that's coming from the glaciers into China proper, to build some transmission tunnels and to get the water out of the basin. And if that happens, then the Mekong's tap can be turned off, right? And during the dry season, half of the flow of the Mekong comes from China, 40% comes from China. And that really spells some danger for this part of the world downstream.
Peter Jansen, someone else, freelancer, right? Can I just follow up on these Chinese dams? You said there are 11 of them, and
right.
they're basically overcapacity, and they're wasting money. So how did that happen? Do they have other sources of electricity supply in Yunnan, or are you saying that nobody really knows why the Chinese are building these dams? I mean, if there's no market for it,
Right.
why are they doing that? Is it, you're speculating that it's to control water or water flow or something? Huh?
This could be one reason. The other, there's just a lot of path dependency for building dams. A lot of engineers out there, there's cheap concrete, so let's build it now while we still can. The deal for Yunnan's dams, not just those on the Mekong, but those in the rivers all around it, was that power would power the East Coast manufacturing industrial base of China that sends exports to the rest of the world, right? And so transmission lines would be linked up to send that power there. That really never translated as a deal for the East Coast and for Yunnan province. And this was a way for Yunnan to stay green. Even though you're building all these dams, you're not bringing in a lot of industrialization into a really, fascinating part of China that's great for, say, tourism. It was already well established as a tourism destination. But on the East Coast, governors and heads of industry would rather purchase power from the power generated inside their locality because it keeps the GDP going and it keeps people employed in, say, coal plants and other energy generation facilities. So the transfer of power there really didn't happen. And now who's using that power? Cryptocurrency miners are hooking their kits up to these dams in the remote parts of Yunnan province and mining Bitcoin and other forms of cryptocurrency. And the industrial factories are now moving to Yunnan. So the deal for keeping Yunnan green is just not translating through. Good question.
Brian, thanks for your talk tonight. You painted brief.
Just
My name is
identify
Daniel
yourself.
Hayward.
Thanks.
Daniel Hayward.
Thanks.
You painted a pretty stark picture of the current situation environmentally in the Mekong Delta, and the raising salinity levels and the really destruction of their lifestyle and their environment, and with that their economic prospects. I'm 700 baht poorer, happily, for just having bought your brand new volume of your book, for which I haven't read yet. But I'm just wondering if in your book you suggest any possible actions that could be taken to even have a chance at stopping this destruction, or in any way, hopefully reversing it, if possible.
Yeah. So as far as the Delta goes, the Vietnamese government is now committed to restoring kind of these natural ecosystem properties, to doing things like as the monsoon water comes into the Delta and the upper portions of Vietnam's portion of the Delta, it's stored in natural reservoirs like it used to be 100 years ago. There are 3-meter high wild rice varieties and what's known as the plain of reeds, and those are the reeds and the rice, and that's indicative of some deep water that occasionally would come into that part of the Delta. And you use that water then in the dry season when it's needed, that would naturally be released and could help irrigate and replenish those downstream areas. That's the type of thinking that's coming back to Vietnam's visions for the Delta. But unless Vietnam has another kind of smart foreign policy towards the upstream portions, these dams are still going to prevent important sediment from being distributed across the Delta. So what my team does is we think that Vietnam's the key to everything. That if Vietnam did something counterproductive, so here's something very controversial, but I talk about it in the book, buy more power from Laos. Get a seat at the table to negotiate where the future dams are built. Don't build them on the most damaging portions of the Delta. That benefits Cambodia as well. Think of the smart sites that are above existing dams, perhaps. They're not cutting off long sections of free-flowing tributaries, and there aren't that many free-flowing tributaries left. These are things that can preserve these flows through the system. And to interact with Laos and Cambodia, not to buy hydropower and a lot of hydropower, to buy other forms of power. So I guess we can't go back to the slides, but I've got a slide of the solar irradiation of Cambodia and southern Laos, and it just glows bright red like an apple, and that's good solar. Wind is well endowed in some parts of this area as well. So encouraged Vietnamese investors to go and build out some of those assets in Laos and Cambodia and work and utilize this historical relationship that Vietnam has with those countries to drive a smart solution forward. Thanks.
You have a question, or please identify yourself and ask away.
Sorry. Hi, I'm Katie Bimson. I work
Hi, Kate.
for IUCN, and we're working on the Mekong Wet Project, which is a project dealing with climate change adaptation. And our next component is actually on storytelling and citizen journalism and training locals to use media and partner with local media groups to tell their stories. So I know you touched upon the gentleman in Chiang Rai, I believe, who is using kind of a historical myth of a man to promote conservation. And I'm wondering if you had a lot of experience with that in other regions, and also what you think the effect of urban migration and people moving away from their local communities is having on the continuance of these stories, perhaps.
Right. I was going to answer with that answer that there is a growing rift between generations and disconnect. Sometimes parents are the ones that go out, right? So you spend a lot of time with your grandparents that might be the ones that are telling and remember these stories. But I mean, you often, when you talk to particularly communities along the Tonle Sap, they'll tell you how we used to have ways to conserve our forests, but we've forgotten them. And there might be a few that still remember this. And so that I think the storytelling opportunity is one that can be and should be emphasized, but I'm not sure how much it's happening as a way to enforce respect of nature, or uses of natural resources, or taboos. You don't go in there, and often those places you don't go in or fish in might be important for breeding and things like that.
Do you think there's a role that social media can play in this next generation of storytelling?
Of course, yeah, and I think young people can use their own experiences and their own stories to highlight what's happening around them. Now, are they going to tell stories of conservation? I'm not sure. But to one plug, the USAID has a program called Wonders of the Mekong, and really all it does is show pictures of big fish that are being caught and smiling fishermen, and then people releasing them back into the system. And I think it has an effect. It shows that fish are still important for Cambodia and for the Mekong. But I also want to say that I highlight a few of IUCN's good works in here. You might know Som Pekade in Cambodia, and he and I
He's
take.
here today.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, then he should know that I'm doing this. Oh, that's too bad. So he's the star of one of my chapters. And we go to the lake and meet with some communities and talk about their conservation efforts.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, please.
And Gwen, I have time, so we can go for 5 minutes or so.
Yes, sure. Did you want to ask a question? Yeah, please.
Excuse me. Thank you, Brian. And Lee Poston with WWF.
Sorry, Lee, I couldn't see you.
Hi, Gwen.
The WWF stories are also told in here. So.
Yes. Great book, really ambitious, and appreciate it. And if I can give a plug as well along those same lines, Netflix, the Our Planet series focuses on the Mekong in the freshwater episode, so check it out if you haven't had a chance. There's also a lot of good online material, background on the Mekong.
Well, and also, Lee, let's plug we're doing an evening on dams and rivers, actually, that Lee's setting up
Great.
Yeah.
pretty soon. Is it June the 12th?
June the 12th,
Yeah,
yes.
showing that particular documentary and with some excellent experts. So
Yeah.
I thought it was a bit far in advance to plug it right now. But anyway, maybe people in this room are actually particularly interested.
Yeah.
It would be a good night for...
Yeah,
Go on.
should be a really good panel, and wish you could be here for it as well. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you, and it's good to hear that you are positive about the potential for renewable energy and solar power, especially in Cambodia. And I'm wondering if, you talk about a lot of these dams, and there's so many of them planned. There's two in particular that are of real concern and that
Right.
may have an overwhelming impact, and that's Sambor and Stung Treng.
Right.
And I'm curious about what your view is on those two dams.
Yeah, I talk about both of those dams in the book, particularly the Sambor Dam, which is known to be the killer dam of the Mekong, right? And it's a dam that could be, if it is built, something like 16 kilometers long, and it's built. What's that? 18. Okay. I visited the potential site in December of last year. I mean, this is a place where the river is like 4 kilometers across. It's one of the widest portions of the river, and there are no mountains around or hills to put the dam's walls, to attach the dam's walls to. So you've got to build this huge, massive structure to generate head to produce any electricity. And this is a dam that's, 2,200 or something, if it would produce at its original design, produce power according to its original design. I think that within the Cambodian conversation at the policymaking level, the risks to this particular project are pretty well known, and that's delaying and stopping any forward momentum on this project. It is part of a pipeline that's advertised by Cambodia's Ministry of Mines and Energy. Hun Sen said, we're not going to build any new dams until after my next election, and now we're there, right? So the conversation is happening again. But if that dam is built, then the Tonle Sap is over. That it's going to entirely regulate the reversal, erase the reversal of the Tonle Sap. So I think it's important to, particularly for that dam, to promote alternatives to it, and several alternative projects have been mooted, building a smaller dam, replacing what's lost the capacity with innovative floating solar on the lower Saison 2 reservoir, a dam that's already been built, or finding other ways to generate that electricity. And I think what's interesting is that these blackouts that are happening in Phnom Penh now, and they've been going on for the last 2 months or so, have driven and moved forward the conversation for ground mount scale solar projects. There are a few 100-megawatt projects that are coming through fast to provide electricity. But at the same time, Cambodia has also announced the building of a new 80-megawatt dam on a tributary of the Tonle Sap, not of the Mekong mainstream, the 80-megawatt Persat Dam, which at the time when the power is needed, right, it's needed to relieve these blackouts during the dry season, is going to run at an extremely low level of efficiency because there's not enough water in the system. So an 80-megawatt dam is probably going to run at something like 12 megawatts. Is it really worth destroying some important connectivity of the river system to bring on 12 more megawatts? Or maybe we can do more with other forms of power generation.
Thanks. We'll let you go in a minute, Brian, but I'd like to have the last question because one thing that has really struck me is that obviously, particularly in this region, a lot of blame, most of the blame for a lot of this these problems we're talking about
comes from the United States, right?
No.
I do talk about how the origin of damming the Mekong comes from the United States in the 1950s and 60s.
But I am saying that in media commentary and general perceptions, China is, and particularly because of the rise of BRI, and in this region, Lanchang Mekong Initiative.
Right.
Also, as you referred to, we talked about the very unpopular blastings on the Mekong, although I must say that deal was, I think, didn't get... I mean, who knew that deal was made in 2016? I don't think there were big protests back then, and they've been quietly... I mean, the big news was that China agreed to stop it, which...
I want to see something from the Chinese side. Recognition of that.
I didn't. But,
cancellation.
The whole point is, I think, so much focus is on China and blaming China, and yet, if you look, and we talked about this before, the Mekong River Commission, studies, tried to do, say, a moratorium, were recommended to have a moratorium on dam building 2012 or 2010? And then, the more recent study that you cite, it makes it very clear. And Mekong River Commission is also supported by Western countries, and there's a lot of Western governments and ADB supporting a lot of these bodies. And really, do you think that some of the if we're talking about blame or bodies that should be actually being more proactive, we could spread it around a bit.
It could spread it around. Thailand often gets off quite easy.
Right, exactly.
In all of this. And Thailand's the biggest off-taker of power. That means there are many, many Thai dams being built in Laos and scheduled for Myanmar to power malls down the road. Right? There are malls like Siam Paragon consumes more electricity than Loei province does, according to Ian Baird from Wisconsin.
How many dams are under planning in Myanmar?
A lot. There's something like China alone has signed up for 43 gigawatts of dams in Myanmar. But the appetite for Chinese dams in Myanmar, as you know, is quite low. How much of that will be built out, I really don't know. I think that I don't know how much we can blame the Mekong River Commission. The Mekong River Commission isn't necessarily a body that's there to stop dams from being built. It's not set up in a way that will do that. And its purview is really only for mainstream dams. The legal mandate of the Mekong River Commission covers mainstream dams announcements. If Laos is going to build a dam, it must notify the Mekong River Commission, then a consultation process happens. And for what it's worth, that consultation process has produced some really important technical innovations in, say, the Sayaburi Dam or the Tonle Sap Lake Dam that, particularly for the Tonle Sap Lake Dam, might actually work for the promotion of fish up and down through the river system. I don't know about Sayaburi. I don't know if this amazing fish elevator that everyone says is really cool will be able to corral these fish and dump them up over the wall. Particularly during a migration season when there could be 30 tons of fish moving through the system in 1 hour. I think there's a question coming in.
This just came up.
Yeah, there it is. So there's the press release, the one that,
For what?
breaking news of the rapids blasting being canceled or postponed.
Thai Foreign Affairs Minister confirms China will halt Mekong rapids blasting.
Yeah. Well, let's see if the Chinese say something about it. China, we were waiting to hear from you. But that consultation process has produced some interesting technical innovations. Where
I just meant that surely, Western governments could do a bit more because they're funders in this region as well.
And I think there are opportunities still open for some smart development interventions from Western governments, particularly the promotion of renewables working with of renewable power generation and working with the government of Cambodia, working with the government of Laos to make their power systems a little bit more climate forward, a little bit more diverse, and that can reveal how these renewables can help reach these economic development goals in the same way that dams can.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much I think we all agree that was an excellent talk, and thank you very much.
Thanks.